Welcome to Digital Currents, brought to you by Morgan Creek Digital. I'm Xavier Segura. Each episode, we spotlight the topics and people changing the tech industry with a focus on AI, blockchain, chips, and big data. Thanks for listening, and please make sure to subscribe if you like what you hear. And remember, stay current.
Mark, we're on a new day, and one thing I was going to say before we jumped on, but I figured we would just do it now, is the audience may not know we're recording this a little bit early for Memorial Day, and maybe we should think about recording this on Wednesday because we're at a new all-time high, Mark, so maybe we should do it.
No, absolutely. The only problem with that is that I would wear the same shirt every time we record because I always wear pink on Wednesday for Wear Pink Wednesdays for brain tumor awareness, and I don't have the orange pants on today, although you can see the orange planter behind me. So I got a little orange. And I do have, Bitcoin sock game. So what I got today, I got the whale sock game. Look, the whales are in charge, large and in charge. What do I mean by that is over the past 6-7 months, there was a pretty big accumulation, like one of the biggest we've ever seen, by whales, and individuals were actually selling down their Bitcoin, which didn't really make sense to me, but okay. Since that time, Bitcoin is up over about 60%, 60. It's up, 6% since we recorded a few days ago. It's up 25% in the last month. New all-time high today. We almost got to 110K.
Right.
And I think what people just are missing is, well, they're missing a lot of stuff, but most importantly, they're missing the macro story, the macro behind what's going on. So there's a bunch of Bitcoin specific things that are happening. You got the Meta Planet short squeeze and the blockchain group in Europe, and you got Nakamoto, and so you got a lot of things happening, 21 Capital, that are potentially going to contribute to demand relative to supply, because the Bitcoin on exchanges is nearing an all-time low, so there's nothing left to sell. But more importantly, and I don't know why no one's talking about this, X, we're in total meltdown mode in the Japanese bond market.
Oh yeah.
And a little bit in the US bond market. And again, I don't mean to be hyperbolic. I mean, I am prone to hyperbole, but it's true. I mean, if you hold an auction, like this happened yesterday or the day, I think it was the day before, in the US, and literally no one shows up, that's a problem, right? Because the governments have to refinance all this debt or issue more debt to fund their deficits. And if no one shows up to buy the bonds, you have a problem. So what happens is the central banks have to buy them. Well, how do they do that? Well, they literally push a button and create new money, fiat, out of thin air to buy these mythical assets that aren't really assets, they're liabilities. And made a long story short, every time you do that, the value of things you can't print, stuff, gold, Bitcoin, etc., is going to rise. And the U.S. said 1 day of no bids, not the end of the world. Maybe people had a long weekend and they didn't show up on Monday. But in Japan, I think on our third day running, no bids. And Japanese bond market has gone totally parabolic. Well, why does that matter? Well, they have 220+% debt to GDP. So they're functionally bankrupt as a country. But if there's no one demanding liquidity, meaning nobody, wants to sell their bonds, and there's plenty of demand for bonds, you're okay. But if suddenly no one's buying the bonds because they're stuck in the unwinding of the Japanese carry trade, well, what's that? Is where people borrow in yen at very low rates and then invest in yielding assets at higher rates. Well, if the rate on your loan goes like this, you have to cover. And so you're having to sell your assets like bonds. And I'm not a doomsdayer. I mean, there are people out there. I mean, Raoul Paul wrote a paper about this, that, oh, we're going to have this death spiral. And Larry Leopard wrote a great book called The Big Print. And I don't know if he watches our show, but thank you, Larry, for the book. He sent me a copy. And he's less hyperbolic about it, but he says the inevitability is there. And all of this comes back to Bitcoin, which is, it's like, no, it can't be that simple. Well, no, it's Bitcoin and gold. Money that is fixed, meaning 1 ounce of gold is 1 ounce of gold. I saw a great picture today. A bar of gold, right? I don't know how many ounces are in a bar, but whatever it is. In 1975, you could buy the Brady house, the Brady Bunch. They had that nice little split level house. You could buy a bar of gold. Today, a bar of gold would buy you a nice starter house in America. So the gold is consistent, but the number of dollars you need to accumulate that consistent amount changes. And that's what's happening with Bitcoin. Bitcoin didn't hit 109.8, whatever, because it suddenly got better or generated more cash flow. It's just you needed more fiat dollars to exchange for that one Bitcoin.
Yeah. And I think that kind of cuts through on a couple of things that we're seeing now, Mark, which hope to be transformative. But sometimes I wonder, let me just be optimistic for a while, and then I'll kind of shift to the...
let's go down the optimistic path.
Yeah. Let's go down the optimistic path. So the landmark passage of the much anticipated Stablecoin Act, or the Genius Act is what it's actually called. Pretty big sign of approval. 66, Mark, in favor, 32 in the naysay camp. And really what this aims to do is to not just regulate stablecoins. I mean, that's actually kind of what it does, but it's more about this legitimacy of stablecoins. And it comes with a clear set of rules and some clarity, which ultimately give, people confidence. And that's kind of what institutional investors want. We saw 27 trillion last year in transaction volume. So when I'm hearing you're kind of just...
Hold on. You said that number so casually. Yeah. 27 trillion. And everyone should go online and look at the picture that's circulating today of what $1 trillion looks like, right? We're all seeing a stack of $100 bills. I went and saw The Accountant 2 last night.
Oh, how was that?
Very good, but
a little too much.
The main topic is dark, and then there's the gratuitous violence, but the acting is really good, and the story, and it has a happy-ish ending.
That's how movies are now, Mark, right? Where it's like when back in the 80s, 90s, in the heyday, you could watch an action movie and not be totally winced out, but now...
Yeah, and again, I know logically that human trafficking goes on, right? I know it does. But I don't. I'm uncomfortable, honestly, as a human, being confronted with it and seeing the images of it. And again, they don't show anything totally. They come really close to something like so horrible that you wouldn't be able to unsee it. But they saved the day. And Ben Affleck is just such a great actor. But my point there is, in the movie, his brother hands a lady of ill repute a stack. Actually, Ben hands it to him. A brother says, hey, give him the money. And we know what a stack of $100 bills looks like. But $1 trillion is football fields of pallets stacked 4 feet high. And you just said 27 trillion. So this idea that these stable coins need the approval of 100 congressmen and senators who many of them, particularly the ones who voted against, are financed by the banks. Ms. Warren like this, like all pissed off. Yeah, because your biggest donors are the banks and the healthcare companies. So yeah, you don't like JFK, and you certainly don't like, stablecoins. Visa, MasterCard, pay your bills. And
So we're seeing this as an accumulation pattern, right, Mark? Because you got to have known some of the companies that were being very acquisitive in this time, right? We saw Coinbase be very acquisitive.
Yeah.
We saw Block be very acquisitive. And we saw, several others along the way that have really kind of, bet their next couple of quarters on, number one, this act not only passing, which it's on its way to doing as it moves through the proper channels, but that also this is the way that money is going to flow. Kind of to your other point about if you're looking at the analogy of how much your buying power is relative to a gold brick, Mark, this is where I'll go slightly controversial, and maybe we can pick this up. This idea, stable coins do not solve inflation. If anything, stable coins are just a quicker mechanism to allow for transactions that have been kind of outdated through a legacy rails of ACH and through Fedwire, but they do not sort of solve this inflationary problem. Therefore, in my opinion, they were kind of the least offensive crypto type of legislation, and it should have been unanimous because if anything, this strengthens.
Oh my gosh! It's such an important point, right? The largest owners of U.S. Treasuries are eventually going to be stablecoin issuers,
right?
Because they're backed by fiat. So to your point, all they are is faster fiat. So the maxis would say, "Oh, that's horrible." No, stop. Other than Steak and Shake, right, which now is taking Bitcoin payments, most places don't accept Bitcoin payments today. At some point in a, distant future, all financial transactions will be in crypto. Now, whether they're all in Bitcoin, that remains to be seen. It's possible, certainly possible. But today, all my savings that I can goes into Bitcoin. But my day-to-day, I don't pay my bills in Bitcoin. I don't pay my taxes in Bitcoin. I don't pay for lunch with Bitcoin. That's in fiat. So but I don't hold that fiat long enough for it to devalue a lot. Right?
Well, quick question on that, Mark. Quick question on that. So obviously we think about the instability in terms of, Bitcoin just moves very, very quickly on a 70 vol asset. But could we also see a future where people don't pay in Bitcoin because it's more valuable than what they're buying, right? So we had this idea that a Knicks ticket costs the cheapest ticket to the Knicks. Sachin is definitely listening somewhere. It's going for a lot of money, right? I'm not sure what the cheapest ticket is, but it's going for a lot of money. And you have some tickets that are greater than the price of one Bitcoin. But I don't see anybody, at least that I'm aware of, that is buying for a Knicks ticket, as rare as that is, with one Bitcoin, Mark. So perhaps it's too.
No, 100%. And that's because you're absolutely right. Look, people, and we've seen this for 5,000 years, people hoard gold for a reason.
Right.
Right? They don't actually spend it. You don't see people walking around with Krugerrands, handing them out on the corner. They hoard the gold and they put it in a safe and they put it in Fort Knox and they put it in Swiss banks. And then they operate in a fiat system that sits on top of gold as the base layer of money. Same thing is going to be true because they know over time that gold becomes more valuable. Now, again, the gold didn't change. The molecular. Now, the one thing is there was a story, right, that last week they produced gold using a super collider or something, the alchemy.
Yep.
And I didn't read the whole thing. And so one, is it actually gold, or is it kind of close to gold? And is it fine enough that it would compete with, 24 or 14 karat? And most importantly, how much did it cost to operate that super collider to get that little tiny piece of gold? They're going to create all this gold. Well, if it costs like $1 million to produce, half a microgram, they're not gonna, because that's not efficient. So I think the interesting thing here is that hoarding Bitcoin like hoarding gold, absolutely, you're right. Why would you part with it for a temporal, like, to me, why would anyone, literally, I mean, I like sports as much as anyone, but why would anyone in their right mind spend $100,000 for a ticket, okay, for a sporting event that lasts a couple hours? Now, to me, the only person who would do that is someone who has so much money that it doesn't even mean anything to them, right? But to actually say, oh, I'm going to take money out of my kids' mouths. In fact, by the way, we look like a gender reveal. So hopefully you're not already talking about number 3, because we look like we're having a gender reveal today.
That's right. That's right. We got the baby blue and the baby pink.
Yep. Yep.
And I'll also give a shout out to my good friend Bill, who also listens and is a fan of the show. I had to remind Bill that we do record this on the video, so that's why we made kind of the gender reveal joke here. And I think it's, really telling here, Mark, as we kind of maybe shift gears and talk a little bit about AI, we were thinking a little bit about how a lot of these new companies are going to ultimately steal market share or steal the gold from the internet, which is advertising, right? And so that idea with OpenAI was, well, I think you were even telling me, Mark, that there's coming a day very quickly, and even you're seeing it in your own personal use, where you're not going to Google anymore. You're going to your AI engine of choice for the same things that you would go in a Google search. Well, of course, Google's a very big and smart company. They're not to be outdone or left behind. So in this big overhaul that we have been kind of expecting for some time, there is a new change, and Google has unveiled their AI mode. And so basically what that looks like is this conversational chat-like bot infrastructure, kind of like a ChatGPT, but now it's available to all Google search users as part of Chrome. And so, the idea is that it's going to, and Sundar, their OpenAI, the CEO of Google, mentioned that it's a total reimagining of search, Mark, with the potential to serve 8.5 billion daily queries. Mark, is this going to be enough to sort of stop the sharks from fleeing in the water? We're going to see how it's going to fare in the AI world, because that's a real threat.
On a sum of the parts, Google is a tremendous buy, particularly if you look at the Mag 7. It's the cheapest of them. The challenge is not all, but a very large percentage of their revenues, certainly not all, came from this search. And it's really not search. I talk about this all the time. What Google did is, and people forget this, in 1996, when they kind of came out, they were the number 21 search engine. And everybody said, well, why would you invest in that? I mean, we got Alta Vista, we got Web Crawler, we got Ask Jeeves, right? Which was, It wasn't conversational, but you could ask it a question and it would find what you needed. And they said, well, because we're not a search engine. They call themselves a search engine, but they're not. They're an indexer. What does that mean? Well, if you type a question into the search bar, it doesn't go search the internet for the answer. It already knows where the answer is, and it owns the website with all the answers, and it sends you there. Now, it may do some auxiliary search on the margin if you ask it something unique. And if you really ask a unique question that's never been asked before, which is pretty unlikely given there's 9 billion people in the world, or almost 9 billion, someone's asked the question. Then they have to create a new website. But that model is so good relative to search, meaning if I type a search and they have to go search, I'm going to wait, I might get good, I might get bad, they might not find what I need. Whereas if you have honed from all of this activity and you separate the wheat from the chaff and you get the right answers and it's accurate and it's quick, I'll pay for that, meaning I'll tolerate some ads at the top, or I'll tolerate being kind of guided to, the preferred placement on the page. And I might even tolerate some banner ads, although my brain actually works that I don't see them. I literally, if you asked me what's on the side of my screen, I couldn't tell you. But all that said, that advertising revenue is gigantic. Well, with, the ChatGPT model or the DeepSeek model, you don't get ads served today.
No.
You type in your question, it gives you the LLM answer.
Right.
And look, 2 years ago, I was not a believer. They were horrible. The hallucinations were terrible. We've talked about it on the show over the past year. Today, they're actually pretty good. I use it, much more frequently. I'm still not paying for it, but I'm still using it. And, probably 4 days out of 7, I reach my limit, right, where I'm not allowed to do any more free searches. I'm like, okay, I'll just stop working. I'm just kidding.
Or you're satisfied with a slightly less good search, which is still adequate if you're not necessarily like a business.
Yeah, but this is a long-winded way of saying what Google should be able to do, given that they have more data, right? Because at the end of the day, we've talked about this, the D in our ABCDs, the D is the key. The more data you have, the better your processing and the better your analytics, the better your tools, the better your organization. And so they win in the data and the organization. So they should, in theory, be able to generate bigger, better, faster AI answers. Now, are they going to charge me for it somehow? Or are they going to, if now I come back to them, are they going to find another way to show ads? Because I'm not going to click on anything because I ask a question, it gives me the answer. I don't have to go click and find it. We'll see. I think they're a really smart company and they will probably figure it out. I do think the bigger question for me is this idea of an agentic future.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have this, we're so lucky, right? We have our fund, and then our fund on occasion will make small investments in other kind of micro cap managers that really investigate the really emerging stuff. And they're the young people, and they're, and so there's this manager that I follow a lot. I drop in on their weekly call every few weeks. And they yesterday were talking about this agentic system that exists. It's tokenized, so you can buy the token to get a piece of this system. And they talked about this idea that there is a future, and there's a big commentator, I can't remember who it was, who was saying this maybe over the weekend. In the future, humans will no longer be involved in any financial transactions. Like, think about paying your bills, paying your mortgage, paying for your groceries, paying for your gasoline or your electricity for your car. All of that's going to be done agent to agent, physical things, the Internet of Things. Like, that's okay, that's interesting. But then even beyond that, will we have literally AI associates, agents, who we can say, hey, X and I are going to have a conversation at the end of the week. Go find me, the 10 things that we need to do. And make sure you do that every Thursday night, so I have it for first thing Friday morning. And we used to have a human doing that, right? And, loved what Ryan did. But this could be, or Michael, this could be, it's just like, I watched, I hate to admit it. Actually, I don't hate to admit it because I love this movie. I watched Maverick, Top Gun Maverick again this week. We're down a lacrosse tournament.
There's no reticence needed. That is objectively a good movie.
So, when I hit 21, I thought that was cool because, that's the Bitcoin number. I'm well approaching 30 now. And there's just a great line when Admiral Kane says, sooner rather than later, Maverick, pilots like you, won't exist. Pilots that need to eat, sleep, take a piss, disobey orders. And I love Maverick's response, right? Which is, maybe so, but not today.
Not today.
Not today. And so we're not there, but we're going there. And then there's this whole fear, that's going to destroy all these jobs. I'm like, yeah, but it will create actually more jobs, believe it or not. This is the part that most people don't believe. And I don't really love a future where everyone simply exists to entertain each other.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, some people prepare food, some people prepare, entertainment, some people, I'm not sure that's the only purpose of life, but
Right.
okay.
There's some other larger pursuits. And I think, Mark, that kind of harkens back to that chart of the week we did earlier this year where we spoke about the industries impacted by AI, and it was basically every industry. And so, with Google, to your point, 50 billion comes from search advertising revenue in Q1, more than half of the 90 billion overall, right? So this is definitely going to be, no small drop in the bucket. So as they look to figure out how to productize AI, I think, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see a world where there's a license, right? Where you have this AI Pro that Google mentioned. It's $25 a month. And if you want more advanced features, it goes from $250 to $200. I call it the car wash analogy.
Yes, exactly.
You want something very quick. You're just the exterior, you have no time. And then it kind of goes, you have to leave your car there and come back for it a couple of days later. And that's ultra expensive. But as we kind of look to this world, Mark, I want to get your thought on this not so big news piece, but I thought was worthy of our attention. So we talk a lot about SoftBank. Usually it's in reference to how much they overpay for certain things.
Yeah.
But we also kid and jest because they have done a lot of really important things over the years, and they really signal market trends. You can question about, are they signaling the end of a market cycle or the beginning based on their track record? But one thing that I think was very interesting is they upped their stake in a couple of key companies when they released their 13 Fs. So they disclosed that they added to the war chest from a couple of companies, TSMC and Oracle, and they exited SoundHound AI, and they also stacked onto NVIDIA. So in particular, these were pretty big moves, Mark. So they added close to 2 billion shares in TSMC. Sorry, 2 million, not 2 billion, 2 million with an M, and 1.2 million in Oracle. And so what this means to me is, if you look at this global supply chain for semiconductors, we know where the concentrations are coming from. It's not in the U.S., unfortunately. It's not today, to quote Maverick, but in a negative way. But Japan plays this kind of highly important role, right? Where they're kind of this electronics hub, but in particular, they are a bit of a supplier for some of these materials, right? So you have a lot of silicon wafers actually originating from China, a lot of the chemicals like hydrogen fluoride. So if I look at this and I'm kind of stitching some of these things together, you have Sumata-san, which is basically SoftBank's sovereign fund for Japan, to call it another way. And if they're kind of involving themselves with TSMC, I think this is good for the U.S. I think this is great for Japan. And, their investment is maybe not so much as a market move as more of a market signal that, the rich are getting richer here. And then the world, in my opinion, is getting more bifurcated between the chip haves and the chip have-nots. What do you think?
So look, no question, right? And there's always this experience in every industrial revolution that we've ever had, that towards the end, and this is an interesting perspective, right? Towards the end, you get an increasing support of the leaders who are about to not be such leaders. And so, like, Mark, that's not what X just said. I'm like, well, that's just, again, my perception of history is, if you look at history, early adopters innovate and create these revolutions, right? It was, whether it was, heavy machinery and hydraulics, so you could do bigger, better, faster building, or, the discovery of electricity and the electrification, or railroads, or, automobile, whatever it was. And then you get a dominant few, and then everyone tries to pile into those to keep them dominant. But then the cycle starts again, and a new innovation happens. And so, no question, TSMC, ASML, okay, the company that makes the EUV machines in Europe that all of the fabs have to use to do current semiconductor manufacturing, all based on silicon. There's absolutely no question that is the current standard. However, there's increasing evidence, and we've invested in a few of these, but there's increasing evidence that advances in material science, in machine usage, China just announced. Now, again, people are calling BS and say, that's not true. It's not, okay. Ignore at your own peril. They're saying they just produced a whole bunch of chips without EUV. That would be a really big deal, particularly for ASML. And it would be a big deal for TSMC because and this is geopolitics and complicated, but, I talk about the story all the time that Taiwan thinks of themselves as independent and the U.S. thinks of them as independent, collaborators. China doesn't view it that way. Taiwan is part of China. And you're like, well, what are you talking about, Mark? It's an independent country. I understand. And if you look it up in the, Wikipedia, that's what it says. But if you go in my conference room over there, and we have a Brazil, Russia, India, China conference room. In our China conference room, we have a map. This table was made in China. Taiwan, clearly part of the China map. It's not subtle. And I joke the world map, there's no UK because they hate the UK. But that point is that all this talk about, attacking China and all, it's like, no, Taiwan is China. So you, the U.S., want to work with Taiwan to limit our ability to get chips and to get fab capacity. Okay, we're not a warfaring state. Here's a crazy stat. China's not been in a war for like 80 years. How many wars has the United States been in? How many wars has Europe been? I mean, it's pretty crazy. They've not been in a war for like 80 years. So they're not warfaring. So they're like, okay, you know what? We'll just build our own. And today, this is a crazy stat. For 12 nanometer and above, so it's the older technology, like the chips that there are dozens of them, probably even hundreds of them in your car, but you don't see them because they're, encased in metal. China manufactures 90-ish, and it's whether it's 85 or 92, it doesn't really matter, but it's somewhere around 90% of all those chips. Wow. I mean, that's interesting. So you have this dynamic between, Massa and Trump is embracing with Masa-san, trying to get him to invest in the U.S. and we're going to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. and make Intel great again. Intel hadn't been great for 30 years and they're not going to be great again because
especially, Mark, when they siphoned off their venture arm, which you could argue was one of their lifebloods. I'm not sure what the broader plan there is, but maybe I am biased, Mark, but I think the CVCs have always had a strategic value for a tech company because that's where you can get cheap access to M&A. But, what do I know?
I just had this conversation at lunch, actually. You're exactly right. So we were talking about, in the asset management, we were talking about this. There's this brand name asset manager, and half of their assets are run by their primary guy, he's my age. That doesn't mean he's going to retire tomorrow, but, maybe someday he'll say, you know what? And so I was saying to my buddy, I said, they should be seeding dozens of new kids to see who's as good as that guy. It's kind of what Buffett did. He hired 2 or 3 people internally and kind of let him have a horse race, and then he named a successor. But it's like what pharma does with biotech, right? They sprinkle money into a bunch of biotechs, and your point on these corporate venture capital funds, why wouldn't you invest in every technology that has the potential to wipe you out? Because then you could own a piece of that and become dominant in that. It's kind of what Google has done to stay relevant. It's kind of what Meta, even though, it's so funny. Meta changed the name to Meta, right, from Facebook, and they were going to be in the metaverse, and then that crashed and burned. And so then they said, oh, no, we're really an AI company. So they should change their name to Met AI. Really, they should. And they'd probably get, 20% lift. But so there are companies, and Microsoft, the new guy at Microsoft, they were hurting, and he came in and changed. So good leadership can do that. But it's this idea that if you don't invest in innovation will victimize you. And lots of examples in history. History is, full of examples where you said, no, I don't need to compete against that because I'm unassailable. And then you're in the dustbin of history because no one is unassailable. No technology is permanent. No. And I love talking about this kid. I mean that in a nice way because he's so young, that we invested in. And, he had this hard problem on how do you do matrix multiplication on silicon. He's like, well, we could do it on LCD. I'm like, well, but LCD doesn't do. So no, we'll fuse them. We'll fuse the silicon and the LCD. And everybody's like, no, you won't. Can't do that. It's like, well, I did it in my lab. And so now he's doing it. Now, can it scale and will it truly change the world? And 10 years from now, we not ever talk about electrons again? Will we only talk about photons? I don't know. But why wouldn't you, if you were Intel or TSMC or anybody else, be putting money with this kid and kids like him and investing in these companies in China who said, look, we rewired a bunch of old chips to outcompete these new chips that you say we can't have. That's the way it works. I mean, it's just not some silly example, but when I was growing up, I lived in a typical suburban middle class neighborhood, and we didn't get the shiny new bike every year, so we literally would scrounge for parts. Like we literally go to people's house and say, "Hey, do you have any old bikes from your kids?" And we would assemble what we thought were the greatest bikes in the history of mankind. And I just thought that was a cool thing to do. And, now kids do it with computers and cell phones and they tinker, and then we get this innovation. And I didn't invent anything because I'm not that smart, but it's that willingness to do something different. And this is a long-winded way of saying, I applaud Masa-san. He is mad genius. I invested with SoftBank way, 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 way early, in the late 90s, when they had a venture fund that was out in Silicon Valley, changing the world. And then they kind of became a conglomerate and, outgrew us. But I think that clutching to the big dogs pales in comparison to the opportunity ahead of the pups. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said, Mark. And I want to pull on a thread that we introduced in the beginning, because we have this conversation often, and it's the reason for that is because it keeps coming up in terms of what drives markets, and that is the open interest for BTC futures and kind of what that means for driving the price. And so many times we have this question, you get it probably, Mark, somebody recognizes you and they say, Mark, Bitcoin's up today, why is that? And we can kind of give them a lot of, questions in terms of, or a lot of answers to their questions. But, at the heart of it, the idea of the futures market has undoubtedly one of the largest impacts in terms of the daily movement, in particular amongst certain tranches, if you can figure out where that mark is reset. So I will share the screen, Mark, and as I always do, remind the listeners, we have this available on YouTube. Please check us out there for the Bitcoin stock reveal, which was special today because we recorded on a Wednesday. Normally this is Friday, so we had a little bit of an early peak. We swapped orange for our gender reveal colors, and we are putting up the screen here. what this shows, Mark, I will narrate and you will dive in deeper as per usual. We are showing Bitcoin futures aggregate open interest as shown on CoinGlass. And you're starting to see here, Mark, a chart amongst the many chart crimes that we report upon. The left scale, we are going from 10 billion up to around the 70, 80 billion as we accelerate into this year. And, a couple things, come to mind here, and I can probably pair it as well, Mark, if you want to make some more sense about it. Beneath this shows the chart in terms of what this price cluster looks like, which kind of oscillates around, 100K, 102K. So this kind of shows what that price looks like in a heat map over a particular period and what this will mean as far as the actual purchasing by dollar volume. And so we saw this really big position where you could potentially look at this new all-time high that we reached. There was 1.2 billion in bearish BTC liquidations at the 107 and 108 mark. And what was the all-time high that we reached today? We couldn't have planned this any better, Mark, to record it on a Wednesday. What say you educate the people on Bitcoin futures because it's so important?
Oh, look, so we zeroed in on that 107 to 108 range like a laser because it is, and this is a unique element of completely transparent markets. In the olden days of equity trading and derivatives trading, the insiders would pick off people who would put up, limit orders or stop loss orders and they would make a fortune, moving the price instantaneously to get supply or create demand. And they had better information. Everyone else couldn't see what you and I are seeing now and what you can pull off the internet.
Yeah.
And here, I think what is exactly happening is there is a still huge amount of simple arbitrage, which is the futures price, hence the name, is materially higher than the spot price because, humans are optimistic. And so whatever the market is in commodities, there's a difference. And most of the time it's higher. Sometimes it'll go lower. People get really pessimistic, but on average, it's higher. And so you roll down the curve called roll yield, which is a negative. It's a cost. And so there are people who will buy the spot and sell the future.
Yep.
And they will take that spread. And that spread historically, has been in the low double digits. At one point when the ETFs first came out, it was like 30%. So like 30% free money annualized, and people would lever that up and make really big returns. But the problem is if you're short, let's just pick a number. Let's say you're short 107.
Yeah.
And suddenly other people, for other reasons, start buying and it starts to get close to once it hits that, then you have to go out and cover, right? You have to unwind your position. And you usually don't wait until it gets all the way there because there's a cost of having that position. So at 106.5, you start to cover, and then at 107. But then what happens is if everybody's trying to cover at the same time, you get these parabolic moves. And in a futures market, it's pretty orderly and people can get out because it's very deep and very liquid. Where it really gets crazy, we actually saw this in the little company I'm involved with called Metaplanet. In Japan, if there's an imbalance of buys and sells, they open the stock, what's called limit up, and it doesn't trade the rest of the day. Like literally it goes into lockdown.
Wow.
Well, then what do people do? Well, if it opens up 15% and you need to cover your short, you've got to go find supply in another market, Europe or the US, where the float is infinitesimally small. It's less than 10%. And so those stocks, and it becomes this self-perpetuating, and there's no liquidity. So this is different in that super good liquidity. And so what we'll see, what we're seeing right now in real time as we're recording this, is we hit that 107, the shorts get liquidated. Well, they're not dumb. They just say, all right, well, I'll take my lumps and I'll go redo it at a new number. So they pick a new number, pick 110 or 111 or whatever, and they'll buy some more at a higher price and they start all over again. So then what happens is as they start buying more or selling more futures, that puts pressure on the price and you get a correction. So we went from, 109, almost 110, right back down to 107. And so that's why you see these charts that all look kind of the same. And you can kind of see it in the top chart here. You have a parabolic move, and then you have a lot of chop, and you have another parabolic move, and you have a lot of chop. That chop is called consolidation.
Right.
So the parabolic move happens, and then the markets have to consolidate or digestion around these new levels as the speculators and the traders put it on their new positions. And as I've said this for a long time, that people cheered really loudly when Bitcoin was deemed not a security and it was deemed a commodity. And I said, well, be careful what you ask for, because if it was a security, yes, it would be subject to, capital gains and things like that. But then you wouldn't have as big a market as you have in commodity futures. Like there are futures and options on stocks, but they're not as manipulatable, whatever the right word is, manipulable, as the commodity markets, which, again, there are lots of stories about gold being manipulated and corn and wheat and silver, the Hunt brothers trying to corner the silver market.
Or our favorite, Mark, frozen orange juice.
Frozen orange juice. And it's a movie kind of day. It's a movie kind of day.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, when you see things like this, this idea that if you just keep, wiping out, some of these future prices, and it's basically trying to remove some of the bears. That's why when we get questions about, well, how high can this go? To me, Mark, it becomes a little bit tricky in some ways because it's a game of liar's poker. Because in some ways, these futures are strategic in terms of, allowing folks to stop the bleeding, if you will, in certain kind of upside down markets. But, looking at kind of the major, zooming out, you have the mercantile exchange, CME, they put in 16.9 billion, right? Followed by Binance. So in what world do you look at where, CME is ahead of Binance for futures option open interest for Bitcoin of all things, right?
And again, that goes back to, Leo Melamed, the head of the CME, said back in 2017, right? Remember when we were having that parabolic move from 10 to 20?
Right.
Okay. And he was like, you wait, we will tame Bitcoin. And I was like, what kind of word is that? That's a weird word to use. Like, who asked you to tame it? Why did it need to be tamed? And at the end of the day, supply and demand win long term. And that's what we saw with gold here recently. Gold
right.
for a very long time was stuck in that $1,500 range. Then gold went to 3,000. Well, why? Well, because once it got past all that price where people were shorting it, they were long physical gold and short the future, or long ETF GLD and short the future. Well, once it popped through 2,500 or whatever the number was, they've got to cover. And we went to 3,000 like that. Then we went to 3,300 like that. And then people were like, well, what if there's no gold in Fort Knox? Holy shit. And we were at 3,500 in a heartbeat when they're talking about tariffs. Well, now we're back to 3,300 because we were like, okay, we're not going to have World War III. We're not going to have a trade war. All good. And it's so funny. The tariffs now are still 3 times what they were before all this nonsense started, but they're not 15 times. So somehow 3 is better than 15. So everybody's happy. And NVIDIA stock can go up again. But
yeah.
What I love about this type of chart and this type of analysis, it's a little busy and it's a little hard to read, but it's like anything. The first time you see it, it looks like, wallpaper. It looks like gobbledygook and just lines on a chart. The second time you look at it, it looks a little, and third time and the fourth. It's like the first time I looked at candlestick charts, because you got the candlestick, you got those little wicks, and you got the different colors, and you got the hammer, and you got the star, and it all was Greek to me, literally. But then had someone come explain to me what each line means and what, you're like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Oh my gosh, there's information content. I mean, there's huge information content on the thickness of a light green bar versus a blue bar. And there is information content in those red candlesticks versus the green candlesticks. And when you get, what they call three, it used to be white because it was white and black before color. So 3 white soldiers, if you got, and then you'd have 3 black crows. If you had 3, and here would be green candles in a row, that was really positive. So you wanted to be long that. If you had 3 black, now red, you wanted to be short that. And again, not forever, because these are trading signals. But this is just a snapshot of millions of market participants, views. And I think you made one of the most important points, X. There's a difference between tactical trading and strategic positioning. There's a difference between market making and a difference between pure speculation. Yeah, I did a podcast with somebody yesterday, and he described himself as, I'm just a speculator. And he was almost like apologetic. I'm like, no, that's perfectly good, right? Speculators technically are simply the opposite side of hedgers. What's a hedger? A hedger is someone who sells something that they have using the futures market to protect their profit in their operating business. We need someone to take the other side of that trade. That's what a speculator is. Now, others would say speculators are people who bet on the price of something based on no knowledge, and that's probably the pejorative use of it. But an actual speculator is a very important part of market functioning. Now, I did learn about something yesterday. It's kind of funny. So there's actually a tool, kind of clever idea, and I think they'll actually make a lot of money. I find it hard to believe that there are people that would do this, but again, we're coming to this age where we don't have to work as often. Somebody said they were going to a 2-day work week, and maybe it was even Bill Gates, who I don't believe anything Bill Gates says, but whatever. So this was an AI agent that was making a market in betting on live streamers, gaming streamers.
Oh, wow.
So think about it. You can bet. You're watching a football game. You can bet on anything. You can bet on, is that next pass complete? You can bet on, is this guy going to get 100 yards rushing? You can bet on, are they going to win
at halftime,
this uniform, right? Or that uniform, or what the heck? You can bet on anything. And these guys have set up a thing where they figure out who are the most watched streamers. And let's say you get 2 guys in a, battle royale in Fortnite. You can bet, is one of them going to win? And I'm like, nope, that's actually pretty cool if that's what you like to watch. And
Fortnite is back, Mark. That was a story we didn't have time to talk about, but Fortnite is back after challenging Apple with their in-game currency. Apple wanted their pound of flesh because of their own in-game tokens. But, as we look to wrap up, Mark, I think that, on the point of some of these charts, as we've mentioned, it draws our interest because not only does it affect what people ask us about the price of Bitcoin, but it also signals this broader macro reflection of what the entire global economy is doing, right? Because what this could mean, gold right now is the dominant alternative asset, right? But it's made 24% this year, and it's a 22 trillion with a T, 22 trillion market cap. So that's making it somewhat a little bit less attractive to an investor that thinks that this could be speculative. For context, all the S&P 500, that's at 53 trillion, and M1 deposits, that's 18.6. So when we look at Bitcoin being 2.1 trillion, that's as big as silver. So when you're looking at people being shy from U.S. long-term debt as we approach 5% on the 20-year, these are why we look at these charts, Mark, because the same people that are influencing some of these equities markets have moved into our space, highlighted by CME being larger than Binance.
Oh no, it's amazing. And, it's funny you talk about Fortnite in that, one of the things to do to actually be a great investor, and this Peter Lynch-ism, is observe, what your wife and kids and spouse and friends are doing. And it's been abundantly clear for a while that people are spending a lot of time playing Fortnite. And, like Fortnite just added a Bitcoin mine in their map.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of cool, right?
Very cool.
But more importantly, there was a thing like, and maybe this already exists, but if it doesn't, I want the patent on it. So if anyone hears about this and wants to do it, let's talk. But wouldn't it be cool if you could bet on and or own futures in recording artists? And what I mean by that is when Travis Scott did his concert in the Fortnite town square, he set a record. He had 2 million people show up. I mean, a big concert, you might get 100,000 people.
100,000, yeah.
Maybe you could do it at the halftime of the Indy 500 and get 400,000, or at a big soccer match and get 150,000. But 2 million people simultaneously logged on. Like, if you could have bought Travis Scott futures, or even better, if Travis Scott had a token that you could own a piece of his future revenues that he would want to share. Oh, that's pretty cool. Instead of sharing it with the label, he could share it with his fans. But and you could bet, is Mariah Carey gonna is the Christmas song gonna play 18 million times this Christmas, or probably 18 billion times?
Math, Mark, would show never bet against Mariah Carey on anything that it particularly pursues.
Just go long Mariah and short, and there's plenty of people you could short, right? Because they're in big trouble. But it would be really interesting if you just went back in time and you looked at, whether it was the original gaming platforms and the certain games, and, Mario to this day, hugely franchise, Pokemon, hugely profitable franchises. The one I'm addicted to now, Monster Hunter, 20 years of people playing this game and paying Capcom money. And so if you could somehow, have an open betting market, not on the person playing the game, but on owning a piece of the, and that's coming, right? That will definitely.
And that's a great point to close out, Mark, because what this is showing is the decoupling from the centralization of big tech, right? So when you look at Apple losing their court order, basically they have greater competition in app downloads and payment methods in the App Store. So they're actually now in failure for being in compliance with their order. And they're actually now, according to the results here, referred to federal prosecutors for criminal contempt investigation. So we are seeing this flip, changing of the guard in front of our eyes. But we'll probably wrap it on that, Mark, and wish everybody a great Memorial Day, depending on when you listen. We'll be back next week. And as always, we want to thank everybody for rate, reviewing, and subscribe, and for always staying current.
Thank you for joining us this week on Digital Currents. Check out our links to our website and social media in the show's description box. Please make sure to subscribe if you like what you hear. And remember, stay current.
This podcast should not be construed as investment advice nor solicitation for the sale of any security, advisory, or other service. Investment themes and ideas discussed may be owned by funds managed by the host and podcast guests. Any conflicts at the time of production have been mentioned by the host but are subject to change. Listeners should consult their personal financial advisors before making any investment decisions.